Hello, everyone. Professor Buzzkill here. January is Cervical Cancer Awareness Month, and the Buzzkill Institute is partnering with Basic Health International, BHI, to help eliminate cervical cancer worldwide. Cervical cancer is the leading cause of cancer deaths in low-resource countries and areas of the globe. More than 340,000 women die from this disease every year. It claims a woman's life every 2 minutes. Yet cervical cancer is entirely preventable. It still exists because women around the world do not have equal access to 3 potentially life-saving interventions: vaccination, screening, and treatment. BHI provides training in low-tech, low-cost screening and treatment methods for use in low-resource settings. And BHI's vision is a world where no woman dies of cervical cancer. As little as $10 provides life-saving screenings for one woman. So please go to basichealth.org/donate and join the fight against cervical cancer. You can also find the link in the blog post for this episode at professorbuzzkill.com. How many lives will you save today? Hello there, it's Professor Buzzkill, and we have a wonderful guest on the show today, Professor Heather Cox Richardson, who's here to talk to us about all kinds of things regarding American history. And most of you know her as the author of Letters from an American, which comes out on the Substack platform. You know her from Facebook, and you know her from the new wonderful podcast called Now and Then, with Professor Joanne Friedman. So before I continue praising you, let me just say welcome to the show.
It's such a joy finally to be here. We've been trying to arrange this now for more than a year, haven't we?
Yeah. I asked you about the Electoral College a year or so ago, and one thing and then another, we just couldn't pull it off.
And yet the Electoral College is still there.
It is still there. It is still there. But Professor, what I worry about is everyone knows you so well from these platforms and these discussions and these podcasts and the letters from an American, and they're all extremely important. You're enlightening a lot of people, but I fear sometimes that your own work, your scholarship sort of gets a little buried by this, the new media aspect of your career. So that's why I wanted to talk about your wonderful latest book, How the South Won the Civil War.
Well, I really appreciate that because I've noticed the same thing. And I will say that conversely, I have found that when people do ask me to talk about academic subjects, I tend to talk far more theoretically than I used to. Mm-hmm. That is, all of my stuff is underpinned by theory, but I tend not to highlight it because I am looking for the stories and to draw people in. So when I get the opportunity to talk about theoretical things and the stuff that I work on in my happy place, I tend to take the bit in my teeth and run with it.
Well, good. Let's stay within the happy place. But I have to say that the book, as Buzzkillers may know if they've read it, and of course it's on the Buzzkill bookshelf, is extremely readable. And it not only tells us the story about how the South won the Civil War and the basic arguments, but you learn so much about modern American history as you're going along. So we encourage everyone to get it. Let me start by asking the 2 biggest themes in How the South Won the Civil War are oligarchy and the West. And I think people would be interested to know where this Southern oligarchy specifically came from and how did it develop?
I'm going to do exactly as I threatened and go a little bit more theoretical here than I normally would, if that's okay. And there is underpinning the entire argument of how the South won the Civil War 2 theoretical systems. One is this kind of system that has been explored recently by historians of capitalism, and that's the idea of how societies develop, in their case, around capitalism. I was actually pulling from scholarship from other areas that talks about how different economic systems, not necessarily just capitalism, about which I've been digging into a lot lately, how they develop systems around them. And I think of them as little tornadoes. That is, once you have developed a certain kind of economic system, it tends to spin politics and society and religion and literature and all things around it. So the deepest argument of the way that the American South and the American West developed ideas about oligarchy in that book is centered around the concept that both of them have extractive economies. One based obviously in tobacco and cotton and rice, and the other based in minerals originally, and the large agribusiness plantation / agribusiness / plantation economies that the people in the West inherited from the peoples who had been there before them. So that's underneath everything. And with that idea that in the United States, South and West on the North American continent, you have these little tornadoes, if you will, based in extractive economies that have influenced the ideologies of that region. That then underpins the entire ideological argument, which is the larger, the step up argument that people pay attention to, the idea of the ideological victory of the American South after the Civil War because of its spread into the American West.
Yeah, I mean, when I say to people, well, read this book, How the South Won the Civil War, those in the know will sort of say things like, well, is that really about how the lost cause came to dominate the narrative of American history for so many decades, and on and on and on? I said, yes, but it's a lot more than that. And your characterization of it as these tornadoes come from, a kind of economic determinism is fascinating. And I just wonder, in these extractive economy situations, is it almost inevitable that oligarchies develop?
I never like the words inevitable because...
No, yeah, I know, but it's just... That's why I said almost inevitable.
No, the book was intended to draw people's attention to it because I am an idealist. I believe that we change the world according to the way we think. And you need to understand a problem in order to address a problem, but it doesn't have to be that way. And the book was really an attempt to say, look, this is how things are, but this is not the way things have to be.
Right.
And that, it was intended really to explain American history, but also to be an intervention in modern American politics.
Yeah, and particularly the last few chapters explain how things have really gone in an extreme or almost fringe direction. But I think one of the other things that people won't understand or will find so fresh is this idea of the West. We tend to think, I think in American culture generally, the West is a sort of separate thing from the Civil War, a separate thing from developments in the early 19th century, and that it's a kind of whole nother place. But one of the most important things that I remember from the book is that we forget that early on, the West, the Southwest anyway, is what becomes Mississippi and Alabama. And so that westward move from Georgia is an extremely important development, especially because cotton extraction is so much more prevalent there.
And one of the things I like to point out to my students is that even though the war is fought largely between the political entities in the eastern part of the country, it is in fact fought over the West. Which system is going to dominate the West? And of course, there's been great historians who've done work recently, and actually as far back as the 1960s and even before that, on the war in the West. So people fought the war in the West. But the cool piece about that book, the really original piece about that book that I hope somebody picks up, is the recognition, something that I had never seen before. We talked about the West as sort of a colonial era region, or as a region based in ideas, or as a colonial relationship to the East, all these sorts of different ways of thinking about the West. This, I think, is the first book that looks at it as a political bloc.
Yeah.
And the really interesting thing for me was, I kept seeing these funny things, ways in which, because, I'm a specialist in Congress, so the funny ways in which Western Republicans seem to be working with Southern Democrats, especially on things like the anti-lynching bills and things that we tend to associate just with the American South. But I'm seeing it, out of William-Borough of Idaho. And I was just playing around on the internet and discovered that there was, in fact, in the late 19th century, a Trans-Mississippi Congress. They literally brought the Western states together in they called it a Congress. Yeah. They met every year, and they saw themselves as a political bloc that was eventually going to replace the Eastern American Congress. Now, it wasn't operational for a huge amount of time, but they did meet. They did present ideas. They did try and overcome partisan differences to say we are a regional bloc. And when Teddy Roosevelt puts his weight behind the Reclamation Act, the Newlands Act in the early 20th century, the one that calls for, as he said, reclaiming the American West from aridity to putting water into it through dams and irrigation. That was actually really heavily pushed by the Trans-Mississippi Congress. And he said it was one of the most important things he'd ever done. So this idea that the West saw itself as a political force to fight back against the East, that was the original part in terms of research in that book.
Oh, that's fascinating. And presumably that's fodder for any number of articles and things and specialist things in journals.
Not by me, yes, but I'm hoping somebody else will do it.
Yeah.
It turns, they're just fascinating because if you read them, they focus, as people who study the myth of the American West talk about, Davy Crockett and Kit Carson and Daniel Boone and all those mythological figures. And they're doing it right at the same time, of course, that Frederick Jackson Turner is writing his famous Frontier Thesis in 1893. But also in that same period is when you have the Alliance and the Populists, which are truly groups of people coming together to try and reclaim democracy for the people. And they don't talk about them at all.
No.
They're just not even there. They're the bad guys. And they've got these mythological Western heroes as the foundation of Western America. And I just find it as a cultural document absolutely fascinating. And as I say, if anybody's interested, many of the volumes from that Trans-Mississippi Congress, which becomes known pretty quickly as the Trans-Mississippi Commercial Congress, are available online.
But as you've been implying all along, there's this strange dichotomy where on the one hand, there's an oligarchy that's obviously built up in the South. And on the other hand, there's this free labor, free soil ideology of the North and the image of the yeoman farmer moving out west and striking out on his or her own and building a society based on individualism. And yet these two things, the reality of the oligarchy and the unreality of the myth clash, and the unreality of the myth actually ends up winning in terms of, getting its hooks into popular consciousness.
Well, I think maybe the key to that is the word clash. They don't really clash. They feed each other. Yeah. So I think the important hook there is to think about the ideology, if you will, of the yeoman farmer in the early 19th century in the American East, which is a very powerful image and an image that is not untrue in the North and in the Midwest, but is really powerful in the South. And that imagery depends on enslavement of Black Americans and also in the early years enslavement of Indigenous Americans and always on the subordination of women. So that whole I'm an independent guy thing is based on, and none of those people are my equals. And that idea translates to the American West in the mid-1860s, as early as 1866, with the rise of the American cowboy. And the image of the American cowboy becomes incredibly important after the Civil War. And one of the important pieces of that is it brings to the West all those images of the yeoman farmer, and along with that, the idea of the subordination of people of color and women. And it fits really naturally over that economic oligarchy that had been in place until the 1860s.
And you call this, among other things, cowboy reconstruction.
Yeah. Think about how that plays out. So you've got the Republicans in the East trying to use the federal government to make the Declaration of Independence a reality, to make sure that all men, and they're not really, some of them are talking about women, but most women are certainly talking about women, but most of the Congress people are talking about Black men. And they're really, I'm a historian, there's a zillion caveats, so I'm just going to leave it with that. Right. And the opponents of that in the American South, the Democrats in the South, and also a number of the Democrats in the Northeast, look at that and they begin to call it communism or socialism. Yeah. They insist that the only way that can happen is for a bureaucracy to impose its will on these Southern people, white people is what they mean by that, and that will only be possible if their salaries are being paid by tax dollars, so that the idea of human equality is, in their minds, socialism. And, a lot of this book grew out of my last book on the Republican Party, and that book started because you had people out in the streets when Obama was elected talking about how we had elected a socialist. And I remember looking at that and thinking, really? Yeah, is he one of three left?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And what I don't understand also, and I think a lot of listeners won't understand, is that the glaring inconsistency with effectively the socialism of the Homestead Act and other government programs to sort of give land away. I mean, one of the famous stories, and I hope I have this right, is the Goldwater family being highly individualistic, went out to Arizona, struck it out dirt poor, made a fortune. But as you and other people have shown, that all of that is built on essentially government giveaways.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, by the way, that my material on Goldwater, that's not his political side, his family side, is from Rick Perlstein's great biography of Goldwater, a really fantastic book. Anyway, yes. And that to me is the really interesting thing about American mythology. Now, remember that I was trained in the old folk and myth school of the program in the history of American civilization, which is long gone now, but it tried to look at how American society formed itself around myths, essentially, around things people wanted to believe. And one of the things that fascinates me about the late 19th century is that I think that that's the period, for many reasons, in which American ideology coalesces. And it coalesces around an idea that a good American, and you can add all your air quotes here, but the idea that a good American is one that asks nothing of the federal government.
Right.
Paradoxically, if you are a good American, one who asks nothing of the federal government ought to help you, and not all those other people. So that definition of a good American is somebody who is not organized labor, for example, who wants laws to protect their wages, their hours, and their safety. It's not, for example, a woman demanding equal pay because she wants laws to do that. On the other side, in the 19th century, and this fades away over different periods, it's, the railroad guys who want high tariffs. It's the steel guys who want high tariffs. It's the railroad guys who want free land. It's those people at the very top end of the scale who are trying to put their finger on the government to get what they want out of it. Neither of those ends should get help of the government. The people who should get the help of the government are what the New York Times calls, I'm so sorry, the great middle.
Yeah.
And so there's this weird, and that's one of the things I just find absolutely fascinating about this period. And I actually that was the whole point of that book I wrote, West from Appomattox, because it still goes on. I don't want anything of the federal government, except Medicare, except, my mortgage deduction, except and we still have that weird, I don't want anything, so I get it all.
Yeah.
You want things, so you can't have anything. And that's a really weird, paradoxical, I think, set of mental gymnastics that I think in America, our class identity is centered around that distinction more than wealth or clothing or any of the other class markers that at least people like E.P. Thompson identified in England.
Well, but the myth, all countries have these sort of either foundational myths or general myths about their development or aspirational myths or whatever, but it seems to me that in the United States, partly because of this, the myth has turned into this massive delusion. And you have exactly the same people who for their own self-interest, shouldn't be voting for the Goldwaters and the Reagans and supporting the David Stockmans and the Grover Norquists, and yet those people do. They've bought into the myth to such a great degree that it's overwhelmed them, and it is a delusion.
I think you have to be careful to separate sort of larger American history and the patterns of larger American history and this particular moment. Because this particular moment, and this is actually what the pattern of the book, How the South Won the Civil War, was designed to do. This particular moment looks very much like the 1850s in that it has a number of hallmarks that mirror the kinds of themes that people like Eric Hoffer or Hannah Arendt outlined when they looked at the rise of totalitarianism or authoritarianism. And that is, if you have an unregulated system and people with wealth begin to dominate the political system, here are my tornadoes coming back, they will begin to dominate first the political system and to change the laws to favor them. People are going to get hurt by that. And let's just go back to the 1840s here rather than staying in the present. They're going to get hurt by that. And they're going to be like, you guys are jerks. We want you out of office. If that happens, then you start to say, well, you're not good people. You shouldn't vote. Yeah. You start to see the cutting back of who gets to vote. And when you cut back who gets to vote, what that means is that you push your party to an extreme because you no longer have to appeal to moderates. You no longer have to appeal to the other side. You have to appeal to the people further out, more extreme than you. And this is political science 101.
Yeah,
so
sure,
you start to see that radicalization. And then you start to cut back on what kind of information your people can hear. So in the 1850s, for example, you can't circulate anti-slavery literature in the South. When you get the very famous book by Hinton Rowan Helper, The Impending Crisis and What to Do About It, that was just a virulently racist book that said, hey, white dudes, this system of enslavement is hurting you. And from that, then the next step is to say, say, we could get you back to where you used to be, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when you had land and you had power and you had stability, if only we can get rid of those people.
Right.
And who those people are doesn't really matter. And you can look at that and see the exact same pattern nowadays. You increasingly radicalize a population by taking away their power, destabilizing them, cutting down their access to information, and turning them against an enemy. And that's a very specific moment that we're in right now that, as I say, looks like the 1850s, but doesn't necessarily look like the 1870s or the 1970s.
But is that one of the reasons why, I often talk about this in class with the students at the survey level, you have an intensification of the justifications for slavery and the othering of all sorts of people in the South in the early years of the 19th century that are different from the way the founders sort of skirted around the issue of slavery. And it sort of doesn't matter who the person you're trying to demonize is or the institution you're trying to preserve is. The important thing is there has to be a demonized person, or there has to be an institution like, say, free market capitalism that you believe in almost theological terms, and it just keeps getting more and more extreme. So that you have the cornerstone speech by Alexander Stephens and all that stuff that you just can't imagine even Jefferson, Madison, and people like that giving. I mean, maybe I have that wrong. Maybe I'm making too strong a dichotomy between the founding generation and the early 19th century generation, but it just seems a remarkable shift.
Oh, I think so. I absolutely think so. And that shift I would personally identify as coming from the 1830s.
Okay.
And while people have focused on, for example, the Nat Turner Rebellion and how that really frightened Virginians and all sorts of different things that happened in the rise of William Lloyd Garrison and the Liberator in Boston on January 1st of that year. The other thing that happens in 1830 is the Indian Removal Act.
Yeah.
And the Indian Removal Act is enormously important for any number of reasons. But one of the reasons, of course, is that Andrew Jackson really identifies indigenous Americans, the Cherokees in this case, and obviously there's more tribes than that involved, but what I'm pointing to here is his characterization of people like John Ross as, and the air quotes again here, as savages. John Ross is literally living in a fancy plantation home, speaks a number of languages. The idea that you are saying we're not all equal here is one of the things that comes from that. But the other thing that comes from that, and I'm not even going to talk about the opening up of voting, is of course the taking of so much southeastern indigenous land on the promise to poor white male voters that they were all of a sudden going to have all this free land. And that's how Jackson builds up that idea. And what we get has been so well detailed in Josh Rothman's Flush Times and Fever Dreams. What we get is an incredible land boom and boom for enslavement in the American South in the 1830s and the 1840s that crowds out all the little guys. All that land ends up with the people who are going to become oligarchs, who increasingly put pressure on the system to enable them to continue to consolidate power. So, and then of course they have to justify that. That's when you start to get the rise of novels like Swallow Barn from John Pendleton Kennedy, and the increasing emphasis in the white churches that this is the way society should be, that in fact slavery is a positive good. All that really, to my mind, justifies that original tornado of, hey, we got you to vote for us so we'd give you all this free land, but oopsie poopsie, it ended up with all the rich guys. But this is the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
And again, that's kind of got modern echoes, doesn't it?
Yeah, and modern tornadoes have been brewing for quite some time. What do you think has happened in American political and social history as a result of the South winning the Civil War? What are some of the ways in which the new Southern Western oligarchy tornado came to dominate American culture by the 1980s? And it's extremely dominating, as the book points out.
Well, of course, that could be an encyclopedia.
Well, yeah.
But I think one of the ways to think about it is to think about the image of the American cowboy and how incredibly important that has been in American history, certainly in the late 19th century and at the turn of the century, when we start to see that idea of the independent individual man in the late 19th century, often being a Confederate soldier, lionized across the country, not only in the American South, but also in places all over the North and the West. But really, the image of the American cowboy since Brown versus Board of Education and the rise of Western TV shows, the idea that a good American is this individual on his horse, always a him, it's very much a bromance sort of scene, taking care of his women at home and fighting those guys because the government won't do it, is one that has gotten its teeth into our history and really prescribed roles for what is a good American man, and as we know now, it's a hyper-masculinized version of American manhood. And it's also prescribed roles for American women. So one of the things I always like to point out is that Bonanza, of course, is one of the leading Westerns of all time, first one filmed in color, widely circulated, and Little Joe on Bonanza, and of course all the maternal figures, or the mothers in Bonanza, are not there, they've died. And there are some women, but they're very much on the outside of the stories. But Little Joe goes on to become Pa in Little House on the Prairie,
right,
which again is an image of what a man should be, even though that was completely alien to what actually the Ingalls family, the life that the Ingalls family actually lived. And of course, those diaries and the books by Laura Ingalls Wilder were edited and added to by her daughter, who was a libertarian. So we have this, we're in this weird moment where Americans seem to think that to be a good American man, you have to be an individualist who's out for himself and who's accumulating power and can't work with other people. And for women, they are supposed to be good wives and mothers or sex objects. Now, what's interesting about that is that I think had been the theme that took off in the 1980s and really was in power through about the Obama administration. But now an awful lot of people have woken up and said, wait a minute here, this ain't working for me. And the reason I think we're in this incredible crisis right now, at least in part, is the recognition that supply side economics and the gender roles and the lack of community has really stretched a lot of us beyond our breaking points. And we're at a fight between these two things. In fact, just this morning, I was reading Janet Yellen's recent speech in Europe about saying, we're trying to get rid of supply side economics here.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, there were caveats to that. It wasn't quite as stark as that, but she came out, as Biden has come out and said, this system doesn't work. We have to find a new system. And one of the things that I think for historians to remind people of, and that I think is incredibly important, is this is weird. This is not America. This is an America that has been warped by a political vision. In fact, throughout our history, people have worked together as communities. They have worked together to create governments that were good for the majority of people. There really was a value on community and on making families successful. And as a friend of mine points out, mythologically, you have to have the heroes, right? Shane rides in and he fixes the bad guys and then he makes everything good again. And then crucially, he rides away. And what's left is the family and the community. And we've sort of lost that idea of letting those hyper masculine figures ride off into the sunset and leave us with the family and the community.
Well, Dr. Richardson, I can't imagine a better way for you to have summed up not only the arguments that are in the book, but the general point that you're making in all of your work, especially in the last several years with your outreach in the community. And it's just so important. And we want all our Buzzkillers not only to get the book, but of course to go on and join your Substack group, follow you on Facebook, and all this sorts of thing. We really need more intellectuals talking about this stuff and getting through to people, and you are doing that.
Well, thank you for that. I think at the end of the day, historians, for the most part, are all teachers, and it is an incredible honor and joy to be able to bring other people into my world. I actually think that if people understood our history more thoroughly, we would be in a very different place. And I also think it's no accident that there is a move afoot to deny people access to that history.
Yes, absolutely. And we see that almost every day. Well, it just remains for me to say thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's been a joy. I hope I didn't overdo the theoretical stuff.
No.
I actually do act as a historian on occasion.
Well, but also importantly, I want to thank you, and we want to thank you for what you're doing for the country. I think that this is overlooked. The books need to be read. Your specialist books need to be read. But also this engagement with the public has been a huge success, and we desperately need it.
Thank you. But just to reiterate, this is a team project. You heard how many other authors I mentioned just talking here, and that was off the top of my head. And I am quite literally only translating what we do for people who haven't had access to that information in the past. And just like a teacher, I answer the questions that people ask. So I think if there is somebody to thank for this, it is the people who taught me to write and who taught me to listen and answer. It's a trade skill, really, more than it's any kind of great insight or anything. So I'm really thrilled to be part of this community, but I'm always a little bit uncomfortable when people seem to think that I've done something special. If I did anything special, it was to listen when smarter people taught me how to do things.
Well, and that's not unimportant, and it's good that you're passing that on. So Buzzkillers, we'll wrap it up there and say that we'll talk to all of you next week.